Today, I've got a brand new Fuji LUT for you, and we're going to take a look at it inside of Resolve and compare and contrast it with the Kodak 2383 LUT that I've already made available to you guys and many of y'all are already using. Look at some of those key differences and how we might decide when to use which LUT in what context. Let's dive into Resolve and take a look here. So right now I'm in a color managed project. I've got a template node tree set up. I'm well on my way to getting my foundation in place so that I can begin grading, but there's an important step that I haven't done yet. That's to set up my overall look, which I'm going to do here at the timeline level of my node graph. And today we are going to be focused on implementing a film emulation look. Now, for a while, we've been able to use my Kodak 2383 LUT, which is here in my LUTs under CKC, PFE, and I could drop this onto this empty node here at the timeline level. And I could get some vibe. I could get some film print vibe, right? Got some contrast. I got some color shift going on. I've got a different rendering of my image than I did a moment ago. This is a pure macro level creative transform, which by the way, is my definition of a look. And I just want to point out before we go any further that this 2383, as well as the new 3510 that we're going to be looking at in just a moment, these are fundamentally different transforms than the Resolve Film Looks LUTs, which have these same stocks in their name, because these LUTs work nicely inside of a color managed project. If you've been following me here on the channel for any period of time at all, you know what a big believer I am in color management. You know how much I encourage its use and all the benefits that it has to offer and why you would never want to go without color management. But if you want to be color managing and you want to be imparting a macro level creative transform, a look, as you should, you need to have LUTs that you can use in that context. And those LUTs are not going to be the same LUTs as you're going to find in, for example, the Resolve Film Looks folder. So these LUTs are unique and distinct from those LUTs in that they're designed to work in this DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow project that we've got set up here. So let's just start to look at these two different emulations. So we've already seen 2383. And this is one that's been out there for a while. This is a classic film print stock. It's got a very nice filmic character to it. But let's now compare it to the new guy, the Fuji, the 3510. Let's double click on this and look at the difference. Now, the number one thing that you're going to see when we double click on that and tap over to 3510 is the change in contrast, right? There's a lot more contrast here in 2383 than there is here in 3510. And something you want to be mindful of, honestly, throughout your color grading practice, but especially when you are selecting looks or when you are doing look development, is not to get overly biased toward the higher contrast look. There's kind of a part of our brain that goes, oh, well, that one's better. And I feel like something's missing when you take me over to that 3510. But this leads to something that I really want to emphasize to you guys today, that success in working with film emulation and grading under a film emulation look, a lot of it comes down to creating a relationship between your emulation and your footage and the way that you grade that footage. It's a three-part dance that all has to be kind of orchestrated. Otherwise, you're not going to get ideal results. So just to give you a sense of what I mean here, when I'm looking at this random test image, there's a clear winner, kind of to me anyway, between 2383 and 3510. I prefer the 2383, to be honest with you. At least that's what my eye kind of responds more strongly to right off the bat. But if we go over to another shot in the timeline, let's look at shot number 8 here and make sure that we're on 2383 for starters. Honestly, on this shot, 2383 feels pretty strong, and not just strong in terms of contrast, like what it's doing to saturation and skin tone and like the overall warmth of this image. It feels a little much. Now, I could go to the shot level of my clip, or of my node graph rather, and make some adjustments and probably rein that in a little bit. And that might even be worth doing if there are things that I like about this emulation and I just want to tame in that contrast and saturation. But another option that I could explore now that I have it available would be to choose a different film emulation starting point like the 3510. So if I double click on it here, this rendering out of the box before I do any shot level grading actually feels a little bit more pleasing to my eye. So I just want to point out that when you are selecting your film look, it's not quite as simple as grabbing for the one that feels higher in contrast or that serves one image well. You really want to be looking at all the shots in your timeline and feeling out on the whole, what do I feel like is moving me closer to my creative intent for this project? Is it LUT A, B, C, or D? Whatever look you are trying to implement. You want to look at things on the whole, not just on the individual shot level. So that's number one. And so we've now talked about sort of two of those three legs of creating this balance between the look, between our grade, and between our image itself. We've talked about the look, we've talked about the image itself, and now I want to talk a little bit about grading underneath these and start to evaluate more of the subtle differences that we see between these two emulations. Let's go back over here to shot number one for a moment. And I want you to do me a favor. I want to look back at 2383 here, and I want to flip between here and 3510. And I want you to ignore the contrast thing for a moment. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, if 2383 is coming in too high contrast, you'll back it off a little bit. If 3510 is too low in contrast, you'll adjust that accordingly. The contrast is the most adjustable thing in terms of how we grade underneath the LUT. A lot of what we want to pay attention to are the things that are less visually obvious to us when we're initially comparing things. It's things like our overall color palette. Like, let's look at our vector scope here for a moment. Look at the difference between the 2383 in terms of how it's a bit more primary, it's standing a bit more straight up, it's compressing secondary colors more toward primary colors a bit more, versus my 3510, which has vectors that are pointing a bit more toward yellow and blue than to red and cyan, like we were looking at a moment ago. So we've got a bit more of a pastel palette. We're biasing a bit more into a kind of a yellowy realm. And if you discipline yourself and look at your color checker chart exclusively, as opposed to the overall image, you can see these patches are really rendering in a different way. So there's a fundamentally different color palette at work here. And that is something that's actually quite a bit more difficult to alter or to fight when you are grading at the individual shot level. So even though it's less obvious initially, that's something you want to pay really close attention to. Do I like the way that my colors and my hues and my saturations are being remapped by this look? Because if you don't, you're going to be fighting that for the duration of your grade. And that's a fight that's not always really, really easy to win. So you want to be just as mindful of that as the more eye-catching characteristics, such as, oh, it's got more contrast or less contrast, or the things that kind of jump out to you immediately. Let's take a look at this on a couple more shots and we can see how it feels. Like, here's our 2383 and there's the 3510. So this is another one where, to my eye, I think I kind of prefer the 2383 rendering, but there's also room to adjust underneath here. Like, if I liked the 3510 and if I liked, for example, the rendering of my character's yellow shirt here, or the wall that's close to us on frame right over here, it would be completely valid to say, okay, that's the palette that I like. I'm getting closer in terms of the things that are going to be difficult to move. Those things are in the right place in my look. And I'm just going to plan either here at the individual shot level or even as an addition at my overall look level to increase a little bit of contrast, like so. Here's another fun one that we've been talking about here on the channel quite a bit. We can add some filmic saturation. If I go down here to the secondaries branch of my node graph and I go to color space, HSV, and I set my channels 1 and 3 off. So I'm now operating only on my S channel. Check this out. I'm now using my gamma to add some color into this image. And now I've got a little more contrast, maybe a little bit more color, but I've still got that sort of softer, more pastel palette that we're getting from the Fuji image. I've got a little bit more cool in the shadows, a little bit less of the warmth in the highlights that we were looking at a moment ago. So as I said, sometimes it's the things that are not immediately obvious that distinguish one film stock from another that are actually the most important things to pay attention to and to identify where the things you want to see are really coming out more strongly between one or more film emulations that you might be auditioning for your image. So with just this quick couple of tweaks, I feel like I'm in a really interesting position here, and this is a very different rendering than I ever would have been able to get out of the Kodak stock, for example. Let's go over here to shot number 3. Another example where we can look at the difference between our 2383 and our 3510. And this is one where a difference that we haven't quite noticed before is becoming more obvious. These shadows, the deepest shadows in this image, are actually going a little bit deeper in the 2383. So it's not just how much contrast before we get to the bottom, it's actually the deepest black point is a little bit lower in 2383 versus 3510. So that's just something else we can pay attention to. Let's look over here at shot number 4. the color of this character's wardrobe is a great thing to pay attention to and to see where I'm getting the preferred reproduction between the two. They're just different renderings. And again, I could look at this higher contrast, and maybe in this case, I say, oh, I like the Kodak, but it's actually a little too high contrast. So you could back that off, but still retain that more kind of primary palette and not get the more pastel secondary palette that we were talking about back here in shot number 2. Let's look over here at shot number 5. And again, just kind of compare and contrast, get a sense for the difference between these two renderings. So for me, 3510 is another one that just wins here, not only because it's a more airy, more open, maybe slightly more neutral feeling in the rendering of the look, but if you look at the difference here, something else comes out that hasn't been super obvious in all of our other shots. Look at like the really hot highlights out this window over here. 2383 is really warming those up. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but in this case, I feel like I kind of like the more neutral rendering of the highlights out that window, and it's giving me a better starting point. And again, I can kind of like, as I'm setting my overall look and assessing things, I can get a sense for what do I love about what this look is doing for me versus what are the things that are maybe not perfect for my needs for this project. So here again, I could say, well, I love this palette, but if anything, it's a little bit too low in contrast. So I'm going to go over here. Let me wipe this out. We'll go back over to our shot level. I'm once again going to go in here and just slightly add some contrast, maybe play with my balance and say, I'm going to add that warmth by hand, or even go further into the cool quadrant like so, and kind of find my way with tools like that. You could also look at simply lowering your exposure if you want to get a kind of like thicker feeling image while still maintaining a bit of that delicate sense that we're getting by using the Fuji 3510. These are all different tools that you can begin to use at the shot level as a way of finessing this relationship between the image and its needs and the look and what it's doing, and really filling out that continuum of what the image is, what your grade is, and what the look is doing, and sort of finding a sweet spot for all those things. It's not as simple as just selecting a look and slapping it on to whatever the image might be because you heard that 2383 is the best print stock, for example. I love the idea of having options and options to choose between, and then articulating your creative vision, your creative intent within whatever look you happen to be operating underneath. And we can look at these last couple of images here as just a few more examples of the differences between these two LUTs. So another good example here, we're getting similar renderings, but higher contrast with our 2383. And in this case, we might say the 2383 is what I want to see. Oh, let me turn this off because I'm putting it on the wrong node. We'll go back to our timeline level. So we've got our 2383 versus our 3510. 3510, before I make any exposure or contrast adjustment, it's maybe a little bit easier to see into this image with than with the 2383. But the 2383 kind of has some nice separation to it when I look at the way that my subject's shirt kind of falls into shadow back here. So maybe that's a better place to start, and I can simply go to my exposure node and open things up a little bit, like so. And then maybe even under this 2383, we could steal this trick that we did here on shot number 2 to add some saturation. I'm going to paste this into node number 4, and we're adding some color back into the image, like so. I want to make sure not to go too far with this HSV trick, but something like that. Oops, let me reset that. I think I'm touching my offset, which is no good in this HSV mode. We'll try that again. Add some gamma back there into our sat. And that's really starting to wake that image up and give me a great position for this grade, even though it felt a little bit under when we initially looked at it. And again, we could go to our contrast pivot and look at softening things out a little bit if we like, for example, that color separation or that tonal separation that we identified early on when we made the comparison. Probably a similar story here in shot number 7. If we paste what we did in shot number 6, that's really going to start to wake this up. We can even go a little bit further with our exposure, and that's starting to look really lovely. So I hope this gives you guys a sense for like this inner relationship, this inner dynamic between these three pieces of the puzzle. This right here is the secret to making film emulations work really well for you. You want to have options. You don't want to feel like, oh, I've got my one 2383. That's why I'm really excited to share this 3510 with you guys today. And when you have those options, you now have lots of room to look at balancing things out between, okay, what's my image? What does the image need? What is my look? What does the look do? And how am I going to grade the image to marry it to that look and end up with a final image that really, really reflects my creative intent and allows me to get there in a fun and an exploratory way, and without having to fight against things in my look or in my image that run counter to what I'm trying to do. So it's really a soft process of looking at all three of those pieces and moving them around until they're in balance with one another. And that's the secret, guys. Honestly, if you try to just slap a LUT onto an image and grade it like you would any image and really not pay enough attention to your look, to the needs of the image, and to like the tools that you're using within that circumstance, you're really not going to have much luck, and you're going to struggle to get great looking images under film emulation. But if you can keep these ideas in mind of balancing those three ingredients against one another, you're going to be able to consistently get great looking images working under a film emulation LUT, or to be honest with you, for that matter, any other creative look LUT. A lot of these same principles are going to apply. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that's something you can take into your next color grade when you are selecting and working with your look or your macro level creative transform.